Oh, I'm waiting to find out that, like, yeah, the little like radio, in a way, like, you go and find out if she needs the room that it like wants out. Yeah. Are you sharing your slides? Yeah. A little bit, but it's a little lot. Oh, oh, are you, well, Thinking of, right, it's showing,
Very interesting. Yeah.
it's showing in
Right.
the,
That's okay.
oh,
Even on the.
so the guys got it. Beautiful. You grab extra lunch today or?
We will.
Really?
Please.
Okay.
Do I?
Yes. Yeah, dude, just chop through the code. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. Do we let you here? Yeah, it was the second year here. Yeah, I missed you first. That's okay.
Yeah.
You don't want to miss us. How's it going? It's good, man. You come from? Yeah. Cool. Nice. I'm flying out actually. Okay, yeah, how was your? What you do? Nice. But yeah, dude, we should totally catch up or yeah, yes, I have class at 1:30, but let me see if I can do it. Yeah, sure. Listen, and we can chill out. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
So. Yeah, I shouldn't. They can handle. Yeah. Yeah.
Although it actually worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
Because it was like.
And
I remember
usually-
yesterday, there was actually.
Yeah.
3 days ago.
Yesterday would have been an issue. I can imagine, you know, I'm staying with a friend.
Oh.
Whatever, and, yeah.
We could take it.
I was gonna. What did I do?
I mean, I guess.
What?
Selling ball.
Yeah, Boston. Yeah. Not been there for a little bit, so it's been kind of all over the
You're
place.
having, yeah, all the other.
Yeah.
other kind of-
There, just in time. Yeah, so sorry. No worries.
And then. um,
But. Right. Yeah, very good. Mention of driving to it. Mention. Do you like the discuss? For our paper? He does. He's. Never send you the. Letter for Ian. So.
No worries, yeah, I can always add it when we get to them.
Okay, good.
Yeah, since I'm slowly chipping away at those, or I think, I want to get the easy things done a little bit sooner.
I was just concerned that you were.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
But it's not, and it's like one.
Thank you so much.
You're
for- Oh, I really appreciate it.
But it's kind of a big bag.
So, would you think about this? No, I'm not interested in- it's that you're not doing- That was a question of,
I know, it's whatever I say.
Based on the concern. We fix one, you know, that's see the rest. Yeah, we'll have to throw it out.
Sounds good.
And on the other person, on the alternate guy. Yeah. Was recommended by Jonathan Haidt, the podcast, so I would love to just test. Probably, yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I need to do stuff, so I think that if there's any opportunity. You mentioned specifically, yeah, you mentioned. So. This. No, I don't. I know. So why don't you ask Franz to look more seriously into this? Because I think that I'm open, but I'm not. No. What I know is John and Abe recognized it. Okay. It is not nothing. Yeah. I think it's the 5 billion. Yeah. Okay. I need to look in my. Anyway. Okay. Well,
I don't think you don't have to do that. It's gonna do it.
Thank you. I'll have to the draft. No, guys, no. Oh, no. Movies are not. Yeah, it's true, it's not, it's part of the. Yeah, of course, you're not. Yes. One thing. No. It's still. Yeah. I think any kind of role there. Okay, cool, thanks.
Right, thank you. Hey, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining for part 2 of this mini course series on what I'm calling Capitalism with Indian Characteristics, which is an exploration about unique features of India's political economy and from the perspective of what does business need to know to navigate India's unique institutional context. So this is part 2. We're going to be talking about society. So just as a refresher, if you were not here on Tuesday, the purpose of the discussion is to think about what institutions matter for capitalism in India. So when we're talking about institutions, you should be thinking about rules of the game. And again, when we're thinking rules of the game, what we really are thinking about is real rules of the game. So not just sort of formal, only in the rule book, but actually sort of, in practice rules that explain how economies operate and behave. And so, the argument that I was making was that if we're trying to understand the rules of the market, well, the rules of the market are simply a function of the rules of the state, the formal rules of the state, and the informal rules of society. And so the rules of the state and rules of society, these map on loosely to thinking about formal rules and informal, formal institutions and informal institutions. So in the previous session, we talked about the formal institutions of the state. So the specific institutions we talked about were federalism. We talked about elections in India. We talked about the bureaucracy, and the idea here was there's a lot of ingredients that lead to instability and volatility. So sort of a competitive federalism between states and the center, constant electioneering around the country. It's sort of reasons for volatility and instability. But then the bureaucracy sort of acts as an antidote to that. It has more permanence and continuity that businesses can sort of lean on, but it brings it with its own risks. Today, we're going to be talking about the next part, which is society. And it's going to be a little bit different. So I'm not going to be plucking out features of society that I think business needs to be aware of. It's going to be a little bit different than that. It's going to be more about the lived reality of how business operates in India and the social rules that business follows in operating in India. And so, we'll talk more specifically about it, but it's going to be less about what business needs to manage and more about how it gets done. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about the informal institutions that structure India's society. We're going to be talking about ethnic groups specifically, the caste system, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. We're going to sort of dig into that a little bit. We're going to ask the question about how does that matter for economic development broadly? And then specifically, what imprint does that leave on how businesses operate in corporate India today? So let's jump right into it. Let's ask the question, okay, so we're going to go into like the informal institutions first. And we're going to ask the question, why should we actually think about informal institutions in the first place? Well, one thing that we know when we're talking about emerging markets is, emerging markets, they sort of generally suffer from inadequately developed formal institutions. And so what does this really mean? From like a rules of the game perspective, the idea is, okay, you might have a formal rule that says if you want a loan, you go to the bank. But if the bank is not going to give you a loan, it really doesn't do much for you if that is the formal expectation. The informal expectation is you might need to go to some money lender, maybe you need to go to some like relative or something like that. These are the sort of informal rules. Similarly, the painted lane dividers in America, they actually mean something. You need to drive in those lanes. If you're familiar with the emerging markets, those are more decorative than anything else. Sort of informal rules and formal rules. And so it's important to look at informal rules because they can help fill in the gaps left behind by inadequately developed formal institutions. That's the instinct here. So Tarun Khanna, if you guys are sort of in MBA curriculum and whatever, I'm sure you've come across and you've studied stuff on like emerging markets. Tarun Khanna at Harvard Business School, he's got a body of work which talks about what is called institutional voids. And so the idea is that there are, well, what are these inadequate sort of formal institutions? Well, maybe something about financing opportunities, inadequate access to finance, contract enforcement in general, sort of sluggish court system, inadequate training of the workforce. There's sort of all these sort of formal failings of the state that need to be filled in. And Tarun, I guess, calls it these institutional voids. Political scientists quibble a little bit with that terminology because from our perspective, we're like, well, it's not a void. It isn't like an absence of institution. It's just a different institution. And indeed, in Tarun's own work, the idea is that, okay, so this is just a small graph I just showed you here. These are, the World Bank does an enterprise survey where they ask firms, what are some of the biggest challenges and obstacles to growth? And you can kind of just see in India, the biggest thing that pops out is access to finance, which is one of the biggest obstacles over here. So how do you solve this if you sort of have these like institutional voids? Well, Tarun's own work actually talks about personal networks. So relational contracting, so there's a big discussion about why do you see these business groups, these diversified business groups that exist all across the developing world and emerging markets? Well, what's happening over there is that you have these independent businesses that are sort of connected through informal networks of communication and then which then get formalized over time through sort of interlocking boards and common ownership and things like that. But first, these companies are sort of linked informally and then formalized. And they sort of create these sort of internal factor markets, so internal labor markets or internal capital markets, which allow, revenues and profits from one entity to be shared with another entity, which allows for entrepreneurial activity. And so this is the sort of solution, a relational-based solution to the question of how do you overcome failing formal institutions? Okay. So I guess you can say, so we know that business groups, of course, create these internal factor markets. Of course, also in emerging markets, we kind of have a sense that corruption is a little bit endemic. So having connections to political actors as well, either bureaucrats or politicians, can also help grease the wheel. None of this is very surprising. If I was to tell you that, in emerging markets, connections matter, of course, where doesn't it matter in the world? In fact, there's a whole cottage industry especially in finance, which looks at sort of what happens, what happens to companies where they're sort of like politically connected patrons, something happens to them. So one of my favorite papers sort of looks at what happens in Indonesia when the then sort of leader Suharto was there were rumors of his ill health, and then you sort of had the stock price of the companies that were known to be connected sort of took a big plunge, right? So this is sort of like well known, sort of like the valuing political connections. You can actually do that sort of contemporaneously, sort of looking at the stock markets. So that's in emerging markets. This is also a thing that happens, let me go and say, in developed markets as well. We sort of know from, in 2008, Tim Geithner was appointed to the US Treasury, and sort of bank stocks that were connected to him, through his time at Citi, I guess sort of like rallied as a response as well. So we know that connections matter. It's not really a surprise to say that connections matter. I have some work that looks at how connections matter as well. The question perhaps is more about what kinds of connections matter. How do connections matter? These are the sort of questions that I think might be a little bit more interesting for us to delve into. Now, I will say that the research that we tend to consume, and honestly that we tend to produce as well as academics, tends to focus a lot on personalized connections. My connection to Suharto, something like that. My connection to Tim Geithner, something like that. Maybe it's something about like a friend goes to college with a politician or something like that, right? These personalized connections. But I think what I want to talk about is actually something a bit more diffuse, which is more about social connections, sort of diffuse socialized connections that exist in the Indian context. So for this, I want to talk about one thing that, what makes India hard to govern is a question that we have been thinking about since India's independence and maybe even before India's independence. In fact, political scientists, political theorists have been scratching their heads asking, why does India survive? I was having a conversation with someone after the talk on Tuesday as well, which said, it's actually quite a miracle that India, with its intense divisions that exist within it, has managed to survive 75 years and more since independence. In fact, sort of in 1957, in 1967, if you go back and look at the New York Times, The Economist, whatever, there's tons of op-ed pages being like, time is nigh. I give it 5 years, and Robert Dahl, he's sort of a famous political scientist, and he's got this really excellent essay, which is called An Improbable Democracy. And it's worth just sort of reading, which says, it is really improbable that India could sustain its democratic institutions. Indians are divided amongst themselves along more lines than any country in the world. These include caste, class, religion, region, infinite subdivisions in between. And I think this is the problem, right? When we talk a lot in today's climate about how diversity is a strength. When it comes to building a state, sometimes that can actually be a problem. And we sort of know this as well. You talk to a lot of people, and I think there's a sense that homogeneity makes it easier for governance. You look at the Nordic countries. You might look at like Korea, Japan, China. What allowed these countries to experience sort of high growth, and sort of the ethnic homogeneity is one piece of the pie that is sort of at least cited to. So we can say that India is a very ethnically divided nation. We have all these sort of divisions here. It might be worth just thinking about what does that actually mean to say ethnic divisions. Now, when political scientists talk about ethnic divisions or ethnicities in general, it's a little bit different from how normal people talk about it. I think when normal people, when we're talking about it, we sort of think about ethnicity as like race, roughly. But I think for political scientists and social scientists more generally, ethnic groups really just mean sort of distinct communities that people are born into, and that share certain cohesive factors, something, language, practices, habits, things like that. And so these ethnic groups are sort of these like unique, distinct groupings that are defined in opposition to other groups. And so when you say that India has sort of a lot of ethnic diversity, the idea is that there is sort of like, there is shared values, customs, practices within group, and then not shared practices, customs, values, sort of going from one group to the other. And this is what promotes people to say about India, that India is what is called a low trust society. And so what does that kind of mean? It means that when you have sort of like shared values, that allows you to trust other people within that group. But when you have so many different ethnic divisions, then it actually makes it very difficult. You meet someone else on the road, you actually might have low trust for them because they're sort of not within your sort of shared values and customs and practices. So the World Value Survey tries to sort of formalize this thinking a little bit. And for many waves, going back to the 80s, actually, they've been asking people around the world, a set of standardized questions, trying to elicit questions of values and trust and things like that. One thing that you can do is you can ask people, to what extent do you generally trust people? And what you'll notice is that India is a very low trust society. Compared to the sort of global averages, Indians are more likely to say that they generally need to be careful when talking about other people. And they also think that generally people cannot be trusted, is sort of like, answers that Indians are more likely to say. Now, that is the general story. What about within your ethnic group? So as a proxy for this, you can sort of ask the question about how much do you trust your neighbors? And the reason why you can do that is because in India, when you have sort of these many, many ethnic fractionalizations, you actually do tend to see a lot of clustering residentially. So ethnic groups are very likely to live next to each other. So you can ask the question, how much do you trust your neighbor? And it's actually the opposite story in India. So yes, we call it low trust society, but that's the general story. Within your community, there's actually quite a lot of trust. So compared to the global averages, Indians tend to not be mistrustful of their neighbors, and in fact tend to trust completely their neighbors. And so this is a sort of duality of sort of high intra-group trust and low inter-group trust, which sort of defines what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about the social structure in India today. Okay. So if we're asking the question, why should we look at informal institutions? Well, the answer is you do this so that you can actually try to figure out where does trust reside. And the answer is trust sort of is monopolized by these ethnic enclaves. Okay, so a lot of countries around the world have different like ethnic groupings. What's so surprising here? We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the particular type that we see in India, which is the caste system. Right? So the caste system is a tiered system of social organization. And when people sort of tend to use the word caste system more colloquially, we're thinking about sort of tiered hierarchy, social inequities, right? So Isabel Wilkinson's book about sort of race relations in America invokes the very same idea when we're talking about sort of structural social inequalities and inequities that exist in America. So the invocation is to the caste system that comes from India. So what is the caste system? Well, if you open just sort of any newspaper up or whatever, this is just one example, but if you open up any newspaper, you'll see people talking about SC/ST, which is like scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and OBCs, which is other backwards castes, right? So you'll see this all the time. This is a little bit misleading because this is really just an administrative category. Sort of you have a general category, which is like upper caste, you have scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs. What caste actually is not really these administrative categories, but in fact, it's actually a fundamentally an economic arrangement to talk about occupation. So what you have in India is you have at the smallest unit, when we talk about what is the ethnic group that is salient in India, it's actually the jati, which is, you might call it a subcaste, but there are thousands of them. You talk to different people, they'll say like 4,000, 5,000, 1,000. There are thousands of jatis which map onto historic occupations, merchants, traders, landowners, clerks, priests, things like that. And oftentimes people that belong to those jatis, they have a surname which actually connotes their membership into that group. So that is sort of what is really at play here when we're talking about caste. The Varna system is sort of like an aggregation of what these many, many thousands of castes are. They sort of get aggregated into sort of categories that are helpful. And basically, this is, I guess, like what you should be thinking about. So the Varna system talks about the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas, which are sort of the priest and the warrior and the traders, and then you have like the lower castes, and then there's people that are excluded from the caste system entirely, the sort of like the untouchables, as they were sort of called. And then within each of these sort of Varnas, you actually have those individual jatis, right? So really, the unit of ethnic organization is the jati, which then get characterized up into the varna, which then gets sort of administratively classified, right? That is really what the caste system is about. Now, I should say, so where does the schedule come from? What is this schedule in the schedule caste? It actually comes literally from the Constitution, which actually came up with a schedule and went ahead and listed hundreds of individual castes and communities and said, okay, these people count, these people don't count. And so that is why there's a literal schedule and there's a lot of like discussion and remonstration whenever there's sort of intentions to change it. There's a lot of state-based reservations and affirmative action that is based on who is on the schedule versus not. So you can imagine a lot of political discussion around people wanting to sort of get included on this list versus not. So it is a literal schedule. That is why we call it the schedule caste. Okay.
So can you
Yes.
go back? Because first of all, it's important for people to understand that the word caste is not an Hindi word. It's a Latin word. It's Portuguese.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, that's an important element. But in real life, what really matters, because there was a time, I don't know whether it's still the case, but there's a time where the Brahmin would not stay in the same room with the Dalit even in the class.
Yeah.
So what is the division that is really, because many of the jati, the distinction is in the eye of the beholder. Probably is important for marriage, but is it important for other economic considerations? The fact that you cannot be in the same room, that's a pretty big deal.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to come to this in just a second. So hopefully I'll answer your question. And if not, please, like we can talk more. But you're right. The way like these systems sort of sustain themselves is through having very low, just very high rates of endogamy. So like I think a recent poll found that maybe like under 5% of people were actually marrying outside of their like caste network. And so
Outside of their jati.
Yes, that's right. And so it continues to sort of leave an imprint, and I'll show you some evidence for that now. Yes.
How do you think of the interaction between caste and religion?
Well, I shall show you. It intersects across religions as well, across other sets of identities as well. So a lot of religions actually came about as a response to the social inequities of the caste system. So Sikhism, for instance, is one, which was supposed a rejection of the caste system that was sort of dominant in India at the time. So Sikhism sort of came around the 1400s or so. And yet, when you actually poll Indians and you ask them, of different religious groups, what caste category do they belong to, they actually do find themselves putting themselves into different labels. And it's because caste is actually, it almost predates religion. People may convert from one religion to the next, but they actually do not shed their caste identity, and it is actually it's much harder thing to shed as a result. So there is, of course, a relationship, but I think the point to take away here is that caste is a really sort of unshakable feature of the Indian sort of social context. Yeah.
An institutional practice like this, though, is the relevant question what you identify with or what other people would identify you with?
Well, I think it is both.
Would this like map almost perfectly though? Like do we
No,
have
probably
data
not.
that shows that people's expectations are are reflected in the views of the other?
No, and in fact, the paper that I'm citing this from, it's actually talking about the difficulty of measuring cost in India, partially because there's no great the Indian state
No
actually.
objective truth.
Yeah, it's actually very difficult to say.
Okay.
Okay.
There was a British guy who tried, right?
Yes, yeah, there's some debate about whether this is sort of externally imposed, like are these labels simply like a way to like map onto like a serfdom system, and because it's very convenient to be like, oh, knights and serfs and lords. There's some debate about whether that's true or not. So anyways, happy to discuss. Okay, so the key thing is that caste sort of like continues to dominate social life. We know a lot about how caste maps onto Indian politics. That's not what this talk is going to be about, but happy to talk about that in the future. But basically, a lot of political parties have formed and forged to actually represent interests of particular caste groupings. So the question is, how does this matter for economic development, and then how does it matter for business? So let's talk about how this matters for economic development. Well, what we're thinking about is, these are, when you have sort of circles of trust that are built around these particular ethnic groups, they tend to then sort of become units of economic activity. That's sort of where a lot of economic activity happens. So at the individual level, individuals that belong to certain caste communities, they have access to sort of these social insurance networks and sort of, so in absence of a well-designed welfare state, communities will actually have a social insurance system, which acts in a very sort of real way that, if individuals within that community have received sudden windfall of, some kind of like revenue, some sale or something like that, if they've fallen on good times, there's an implicit tax within the community that you have to sort of be helping out those who have fallen on bad times as well. This is a sort of a social insurance that you have access to. Also, you can talk about, we talk about how reciprocal interaction within the community and the social network means that you can sort of enforce contracts, through social sanction. Now, that's a lot of formal language to just say that if I borrow money from someone and I'm, not going to pay them back, if they can go to my uncle and then make me feel bad about it, they will get their money. And that is really just the way like the social sanction sort of works in the system. And so you have access to that. At the macro level, you can sort of imagine how this creates sort of hoarding economic opportunities. And then what you have is you sort of see these like economic clusters that get created based on these sort of group trust and group identities. So there's actually lots of really, really excellent work that looks at, the Marwari, which is, a historic sort of like lending and trading community in India. They come from like the Marwar region of Rajasthan, and they've extended network all across India. And it's literally based on the ability to sort of, extend loans from one area of India to the other area of India through this like Hundi system where they sort of like, it's almost like an old time blockchain where you sort of like are able to sort of, say that, this person owes me this much, or please lend this much money to this person when he comes to that part of the country. Similarly, the Chettiars were a community in South India, and they extended the same practices except cross-nationally as well. So to Burma, to Sri Lanka, things like that. So it's the same system. In fact, today the diamond trading community between Gujarat and Antwerp, about 96% of diamond exporting companies in India, the social origins of those companies come from three jatis basically. So it is really quite a staggering statement. I mean, you can even see that in America today. I mean, like, if you look at like who runs the motels in America as well, it's like largely come from like one community, the Patels. So this isn't surprising, but you can see that the imprint sort of continues. These are just some books. Yeah. Sorry.
Question for you on the micro level.
Yeah.
I'm curious if any of your studies or research have delved into the Kirana system or like the convenience stores
Yeah.
in India and like the lending that occurs there, and if any of that's disrupted by like the micro delivery systems like Blinkit and all that.
Yeah, honestly, so my co-author actually works specifically on Kirana store lending, and sort of like it is a question of like, who do you give a loan to? So the Kirana stores in India are just sort of like mom and pop sort of bodegas, basically. You can think about them, much smaller than that actually, and they basically run on credit. And literally like sort of registers that, people come in and then sort of like, it's like short-term credit basically is like how they run on. And there's a question of like who do you trust to extend credit for. And there's a lot of sort of like who you know. And actually work that my co-author has sort of been doing shows that it is sort of people in your network, people that you have sort of like 1 or 2 degrees away from, you are more likely to extend credit to in that way. But yeah, I think there are good questions about what can we expect moving forward when you have a more sort of like India's e-commerce system is sort of very it's dynamic, and there are questions to be had about to be asked about whether this level of sort of social trust as the lubricant of credit, do you still need that moving forward? I think that's an important question that we don't really know the answer to as yet. Just sharing some works here, which I found really fascinating, which talks specifically about how business communities have formed in India, both historically and contemporaneously today, around questions of this, using sort of community trust to create these sort of like these ventures. So some things that I might recommend. Okay, so there are obviously some downsides as well. It's not just a great thing, like, wow, okay, I have access to social insurance, fantastic. Well, there are also sort of downsides. So one obvious downside when we're talking about the macro is, well, it's hard to break in if you are not a member of that community, right? In sort of somewhat technical language, you can talk about how interest rates for in-group entrepreneurs are likely to be lower than the interest rate for out-group entrepreneurs, which means it has probably a distorting effect on overall levels of productivity because capital is not reaching sort of talent appropriately. Yes.
I think it's a lot about, happens when society to become wealthier. What happens to these sort of networks over time and what replaces it? Because there's, of course, a lot of economic advantage to be had from these sort of networks.
Yeah.
But over time, India is modernizing, things are changing, right? So what is going to fill that void? Have you like come across any work or in your own work?
Yeah, and actually, let me come back to that. I'm going to talk about like what it means for business, and I'm going to be talking specifically about family businesses because there's a big debate about what should you expect from an economy that is dominated by family businesses as sort of economic structures change, as sort of like markets develop, as sort of like we see more digitization, what can you expect moving forward? I think it's an open question, and I'm happy to just like talk about that.
Very quickly,
Yeah.
related to that, one might also think about how class interacts with caste.
Yeah.
So, as you go up the ranks, you get wealthier, are these kind of networks as important to business as, what you're right?
I think that is a fantastic point. And in fact, I would say that as India has become wealthier, last time we talked about the great sort of liberalization that took place in the 1990s in India. It sort of changed the calculation of what mattered a little bit. So in a pre-liberalization phase in India, where you had more of a socialist impulse, doing business was a bit of a dirty word. And doing business has always sort of like been allocated to people based on these sort of like pre-existing social categories. So now as doing business is no longer a dirty word in India, it has changed the nature of who has sort of economic and political clout and power to different groups. So groups have actually changed sort of who has economic, so in a story of class actually, so who has economic and political clout has evolved because sort of occupations have remained relatively rigid, but economic growth has shifted that. So I think there is a lot of like interesting, and we can actually talk more about like how like it has changed politically as well. But anyways, I'll sort of push ahead for now. Okay. So in the macro sense, we know that some of the downsides are that it's hard to break into like existing networks. On the micro side, it can also mean that you actually are discouraged from risk taking. So some pretty fantastic work by Kaivan Munshi and Rosenzweig at Yale have actually done some very interesting work looking at the caste system and like how it actually creates barriers. So if you are a part of a social insurance network, if you have one of your family members decides to sort of go to the city, if you're like in a rural area and you're sort of someone in your community in your family decides to go to the city, it has actually reduced the likelihood that you can be persuaded to like pay back. Because if someone has run away to the city, the odds that like, your uncle can sort of give you a call and say, come back and pay this person back has actually gone down a little bit. Which means for the people left behind in the village, it's actually a bad it's actually kind of bad, because if I want access to social insurance, but my son has run away to the city, it actually means me as a family unit, I'm actually going to suffer and sort of be unable to access that kind of social insurance. And so it actually produces an incentive for people not to take opportunities, in an urban area away, and it actually produces kind of macro phenomena, like you see a very persistent rural-urban gap in India, which is actually surprising compared to other countries in sort of developmentally speaking. And so there are, basically, there are benefits, but there are also downsides to the same story. Okay, so how does this matter for business, broadly speaking? Well, I'm going to say two things here. I'm going to say, one, that co-ethnic biases continue to persist, even in today's modern corporate India, sort of India incorporated that we think about. And two, it actually has an effect of sustaining an economy of family businesses, which then has its independent effect on what you can think about when you're thinking about dynamism of an economy, broadly speaking. So how does co-ethnicity matter for businesses in general? I mean, not very surprising stories. If you're familiar with sort of the economics, political science literature, you're very familiar with how loan officers are more likely to make loans to someone who belongs to their sort of like social category, their ethnic group. There's actually some very fantastic work that I really do recommend, which shows how when a political party or when a politician comes to power after a certain election, you're more likely to see entrepreneurship happening in that area. And who are the entrepreneurs? Well, they're the people that belong to the same sort of social group as the politician as well, right? So there's a sense of social license that takes place when you have, a political authority or patron that has come to power. So that really matters. It matters for sort of entrepreneurship. Board composition. 92% of directors of sort of the largest 1,000 companies in India belong to the Brahmin or the Vaishya community, which, if you remember, the Brahmin, Vaishya, and Kshatriya community constitute about 30% of India. So like a subset of that, captures about over 90% of corporate boards in India as well. And so you can kind of see how old historical occupations are actually sort of persisting. At least you can say that about the merchant community or the Vaishya. Firm-to-firm trade as well. You sort of see firms, using sort of this pretty detailed granular data about who firms along a supply chain. You can identify that individual companies, who the CEO is, actually, two firms' likelihood of sort of being connected on a supply chain is actually well predicted by whether they share these sort of social similarities and cultural groups as well. So you can look at all this and say, okay, that's really bad, of course, but you can also say, oh, but maybe it's a story of information flow. Right? It's just you can trust the information better. Maybe when you actually have someone within your social circle, you actually have better information gleaning, right? So like the access to loans, you actually are able to tell the credit quality of someone because they're sort of within your social circle. Okay, fine. So maybe this isn't a story of prejudice as much as it is a story of just better information flow. A really cool paper that has just come out recently, or a working paper is out by this person, Soumitra Shukla, looks at hiring decisions. And these are sort of top American, European firms that are going to top Indian universities to hire. And he sort of breaks down the different steps of the process. So at what stage will a hiring manager learn what caste or category the applicant belongs to? And then you can kind of see what that does to the likelihood of receiving a job and the pay scale that comes afterwards. And what you'll see is that basically along the first few stages of the application, there's an aptitude test, there's some group debates. Basically, until the information is not clear who belongs to what category, there's actually no difference between these two sets of people and their ultimate job opportunities. But as soon as information is shared, you'll see it sort of coming out in the offer letter. And to make the point even clearer, one thing that is very cool is, again, as we talked about, some names are actually very clearly mapped onto certain caste categories versus others. So what you can do is you can actually distinguish between individuals who have clearly identifiable caste monikers versus not. And what you will find is that basically simply at the aptitude test level, right? So there's no difference at the application stage, and literally the very first stage of filtering, as soon as people sort of come to know like what caste category people belong to, you sort of see like the prejudice taking place in hiring decisions. And so there is, I guess the point that I'm trying to just make is that, look, this is this continues to exist even in sort of modern corporate India today. It also, I think, yes.
Yeah, just to be clear, the gray doesn't include the informative name, or it's incorporating the informative?
No, it is uninformative. Yeah, it's sort of like, you don't know, and then you do know. Yeah, that's correct, yeah. Okay, so this is sort of like in one way, right? The other way that I'm gonna say that it actually matters as well is that India is an economy where you have about, 80, 90% of businesses are actually family businesses in India. So there's a system of family capitalism. And the story that I would like to say is that family businesses, why do you see family businesses emerge and sustain in India's economy? I think my hypothesis is that family businesses, you should really think about them as a sort of a complementary technology that sort of complements what is the dominant social structure, which is this sort of kinship network. So again, if you guys are sort of like MBA students or whatever, if you've taken sort of like strategy, you know sort of different views of the firm, and agency-based theories, resource-based theories. When we talk about family businesses, we tend to think about what are the unique resources and advantages that family businesses have. And what we talk about is ability to tap into broader, diffuse social kinship networks. So family businesses, they're described as having sort of a very long-term horizon. They sort of like trade their reputation, using trust. So sort of they put their family name on top of the company's masthead as a way of sort of like staking their reputation on the company. These are all features and phenomena which go very nicely with what I've described so far as how the economics of how caste systems sort of like work. Kinship networks, social insurance provision, access to credit, all these things work very nicely with family businesses. Family businesses are, of course, ubiquitous around the world. In India, this number of like the share of the largest firms under family control is probably closer to 80% or so. And the point that I'm trying to make over here is, okay, so the kinship, the nature of India's society encourages family businesses to emerge and persist. And now what I'm going to tell you is that actually has sort of consequences on political economy and economic dynamism, broadly speaking. So one thing that we know, so there's some really great literature in the World Management Survey, which actually tries to understand, how important is management to company success and then countries' development outcomes as well. And I think it's in the interest of any MBA student to find that there is an effect of management because you're paying top dollar for this education. And I think they do find that management is in fact very important to explain productivity of firms and also sort of like macro productivity of an economy. What we also find is that family businesses are systematically least likely to have good management performance. And the reason is you're sort of, it's multifarious, there are many sort of reasons here, but a big one is that you are typically choosing successors based on kinship networks and sort of your family ties more so than talent. And so there's a classic sort of phrase about, like first generation builds it, whatever, like the second generation grows it, the third generation like, whittles it away. That sort of comes from the fact that, managerial genes do not necessarily pass on from one generation to the next. And so when you are, family businesses tend to be mismanaged partially for this reason. And so if we know that management matters for company success and then countries' development outcomes, then having an economy filled with family businesses means that you're sort of more likely to get sort of mismanaged firms or, they also tend to sort of like grow more slowly. So this is something about economic dynamism, broadly speaking. And again, this kind of comes from a number of different channels and mechanisms. But one interesting way is to think about delegations. So a big problem within family businesses is who to trust in order to delegate. Trust is a big issue, and you can trust your family member, you may not be able to trust outsiders. And so given that, once you sort of constrain yourself to only being able to choose from your family members, well, your family members, you may sort of, you try as you might, your natural pool of which you may choose from is a much smaller pool for family members than the world of sort of talented professionals. And so you will end up sort of, your choice pool might be a little more limited. And so that might actually mean you will end up being able to hire fewer managers, which then means you will sort of end up sort of like entering fewer new ventures. And that means that there's a natural limit to how much you can actually grow. Similarly, that's like sort of an economic explanation. It might just be something more simple that, family businesses are more interested in staying for the long run rather than sort of like taking on new growth opportunities. And so all that sort of produces sort of, a story of sort of constrained business dynamism more broadly. In some work that I've done, I've shown how family businesses often blend, the individual versus the corporate entity. And so what you end up finding is that political activity of these family businesses oftentimes look like the political activities of just the individuals behind it, right? So you have very little accountability on the corporate board, and so you're sort of the CEO of a family business is sort of able to express their like personal whims and fancies in this political system as well. And why do we care about that? Well, we kind of tend to think that businesses have a channel, a lever to hold politics and policymakers accountable. But when you have individuals thinking about, their politics based on whatever they might be interested in, as opposed to necessarily the bottom line of their businesses, that kind of changes the dynamics of accountability for business and politics as well. So what can we expect moving forward? I'm just going to end briefly by talking about, so it is an open question about whether family businesses, this nature of ethnic capitalism that I've described, is going to continue moving forward or not. I think a number of questions have already sort of pointed to the fact that India has sort of very quickly, fast-changing economic dynamism. There's digitization. You have sort of like more deeper and deeper sort of like equity markets, debt markets are developing. When you have sort of formal institutions are developing, what will happen to the informal institutions that we have been talking about today? It's an open question, and I think there are sort of two schools of thought. One school of thought says that these informal systems are simply responses. They are simply fixes to inadequate formal systems, which means once you fix the formal system, these things should go away, which means you should see fewer family firms. And certainly with the story of the West has been a decline of family capitalism in favor of more formalized systems and of promotion and professionalization. Or on the other hand, it could be that the ethnic and kinship networks that define India's society is actually just very strong. And family businesses and family capitalism is simply an expression and the natural form that emerges when you have a system, a social structure that creates family businesses in general. So there's some interesting work that discusses these two sort of channels, and hopefully future work that I'm going to be doing will try to distinguish between like what you can actually expect moving forward. But it is an open question for now. Okay, so just to summarize, and then we'll take some questions. Much like last time, we just talk about what are some of the big takeaways. Again, this is less so about what businesses need to know to manage, the social structure, and more how does business what is the vernacular of business in India is the question. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that you need to pay attention to the structure of society, recognize the role of caste and different ethnic divisions that might sort of dominate. These ethnic divisions in India, they have material economic consequences, and they also have material business consequences. And so with that, I'm gonna pause, and I'm happy to take some questions. Yes.
So yeah, I think it was about like when you're discussing the economic development consequences of castes, and I think there was a research paper by Raj Chetty and Eric Zwick and co-authors, like said that most of the entrepreneurial class, even in like developed societies, come from like a very segmented race and like
Yeah.
also wealth levels. I would imagine whether that persists or if you have seen any work in India where you see this, there's differential social upward mobility because you
Yeah.
talked about like low trust. So you have a lot of like banking and financial intermediation, which is collateral based, and who holds collateral also goes back to
Correct.
this, inequalities which persisted from before. So
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think there's sort of definitely attempts to change that. Sort of there's like work on Dalit entrepreneurship and trying to make sort of credit available to historically disadvantaged and sort of like people who have not had access to the sort of formal lending institutions and other sort of like factor market institutions. I'm not exactly sure whether this is changing that much, I would say. I think the reason is that I think a lot of the times, and you can correct me, like what the Chetty paper is talking specifically about, but as I understand, it's sort of it's about when opportunities are hoarded by class, you can sort of like create access, you can sort of like try to democratize access to certain class groups, and then like in a generation, you might have sort of intergenerational mobility. There tends to be sort of much less intergenerational mobility in India, is I think the conclusion from some work, I think by like Paul Novosad and others who look at this. And the reason for it, in fact, and it does break down by sort of social identities. Now, it's very difficult to sort of say the specific caste identities, but I know religious identities, certainly Muslim groups tend to have very low sort of intergenerational mobility, and that is something that has been documented as well. And so yeah, I think when you're dealing with more immutable characteristics that you are born into, that you cannot just shake off, I think it means that the sort of intergenerational dynamism is a bit more attenuated. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any research or anything specific about how the state might try to influence whether or not there's family capitalism versus international capitalism versus its own form of national capitalism?
That's interesting. So I mean, I think there is a lot. I think the state definitely has its views on like what kind. I think it definitely hinges on the sort of national versus international capitalism. I think as far as a view on family capitalism necessarily goes, I think that is less prominent in those discussions. And I think it is just sort of a background fact of firms in India. And I think political parties, so separating between like the government and like political parties, but I think political parties certainly benefit from having family capitalism because you can sort of develop those ties based on richer personal networks and shared values and customs rather than something like a quid pro quo, here's what I can get you. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question. Okay. Yeah.
You talked in the end about these two things that could happen, right, going forward, that you could have these informal systems that sustain versus it gets replaced by the formal systems, right? But I can offer maybe something in the middle, right, that you sort of end up with a system where the key levers that make these informal systems work, for example, migration, right?
Yeah.
People migrate more, informal structures fall apart, but they don't get replaced by formal systems as fast.
Yeah.
And so you end up with something in the middle that could be much worse than being either all informal or formal. So what do you think of that?
That's very interesting. And there is a lot of sort of internal migration that is like taking place in India as well. And so it would be, honestly, I think it's an interesting empirical question. It is something that my co-authors and I are attempting to research by using sort of multiple waves of like the economic census to try to figure out like how economic institutions have like developed and evolved and like whether the familyness of capitalism at different locations have changed over time. But this is an interesting point that you're saying because there's sort of like, as demographics shift as well, you might find yourself at like a different equilibrium or something like that. I would love to chat more if you have some ideas of how to sort of, but I do think that's an empirical question. I think it's an important one as well.
Is that a working paper? Can I go
No, it's just some R code right now. it will soon become a draft, and then I'll be sure to share it. Okay, yeah.
So one of my questions was actually if there was empirical evidence, and in particular, empirical evidence of moving backwards. So like a collapse of the financial system leading to an increase in family capitalism. And the reason is because I want to push back. I like to be provocative on your description of the family business as an adoption of a technology that is complementary to the system. And I want to make an analogy that, you know, if I'm farming with a hoe, like that is a technology, hoe. I can't adopt a plow until I've first adopted the technology of clearing stones from my field, right? And I'm in an environment where a plow can function, right? And then similarly, I can't adopt a tractor until I'm in an environment where I can access the necessary parts and fuel on a regular basis. And so there's an institutional technology that has to be adopted first before I can adopt the next step in the technological process, which you've documented very clearly the drawbacks of family capitalism, although there is a very compelling story to see like Germany still having such a high prevalence. So, you know, it's not a complete story, and I don't want to be seen as like a modernist theorist here. Like that's not my primary objective, but I think of it as much, I see it as much more a lack of adoption of the next level of technology because there's not an institutional technology that's been adopted that allows for you to move to other forms of capitalism or just business management in general that would be more productive.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like there's a story of transition and change requires, I mean, you need to like see the mechanisms, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. Oh, it looks like we have better labor markets or equity markets, so we should just stop sort of, you know, like let me fire my son. Like that doesn't happen like that. I agree with you. Honestly, I think one of the an area of interest for me is to understand how this evolution happens. I kind of suspect family offices might be playing an interesting role in lubricating this change, because there's a question of like, okay, you know, family businesses oftentimes just persist because it's sort of like, well, this is like historically what you've been doing, and it's like a wealth preservation, you know, kind of a thing, you know. I think family offices are becoming increasingly popular, especially around Asia and Europe, especially in Asia. And I suspect that it's a way of sort of like allowing for the preservation of wealth and capital, but freeing up the business to be taken over by sort of like more, more dynamic actors. It's typically a story of private equity, actually. But yeah, I think that is a mechanism that I am interested in exploring as well. But I agree with you that until we know what institutional mechanisms actually are created to allow for this transition, there's no reason to think that there would be a transition at all. Yeah, that's right.
And do share that working paper when it comes out.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yes.
All right, well, first, thank you for your talk. I have two quasi-related questions, or related in my mind at least. To start off, I was hoping you might be able to like actually bridge us back a little bit to the last session.
Yes.
And tell us if there's a story to interact the caste networks here with bureaucracy from last time.
Yeah.
And specifically thinking about that like really high selection rate. But I also have in mind thinking about this old book like Imagine Communities, where it's the circulation of like people in the peripheral of a nation to the center for the bureaucracy and back out, being that engine that helps to create that national unity. So I'm wondering like, is that work being achieved by India's bureaucracy, or is this just a high selection for certain castes going in there? And I think along a similar line, that same circulation in and out from the periphery to the center was also historically an engine for creating national identity through language. Since, you know, like making proper Frenchmen is syncing up, getting people from Bordeaux and Champagne to all speak roughly the same French and establish that that like linguistic commonality is a marker empirically of that some level of that social trust. So I know that there's a lot of linguistic divisions in India, but I'm wondering if you can like read that narrative together there as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I could be able to speak more about the second part, but certainly on the first part, I think it is actually very interesting. The social makeup. because the caste system is ultimately fundamentally an occupation story, you can draw, old occupations to modern occupations, and you can kind of see the social groups that that get created, so like social like clusters that get created. So historically, the bureaucracy has selected people who have come disproportionately not from the merchants and the trader communities of India. And so it helped promote for many, many decades a system where the vaunted elites of India, who were like these bureaucrats, thought that business and trading was a dirty activity. And so you sort of have this sort of separation where you have, I think that is changing now. But if you look at accounts of like from the 60s and the 70s and all that, there was a lot of mistrust amongst bureaucrats and the upper echelons of the political party process, where there was a lot of mistrust of business and business communities as well. And I think part of the reason for that was that you didn't have the sort of the social mixing, because you just had like social segregation, and then the occupational roles were different in society as well. I think that is changing now. And I think when you look at political parties as well, it's like an interesting, it's instructive. The number of business people that are now sitting in houses of parliament, it has only gone up. And it basically goes up alongside liberalization, the development of like India's economy, things like that. So economic power and political power are sort of very much linked. And you're sort of seeing that people with business backgrounds who come from business trading communities have sort of gone up over time. But if you look back in the past, in the sort of like the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had very few individuals with sort of like merchants and trader backgrounds, both vocationally and sort of like socially speaking as well. So yeah, I think I would just simply echo your curiosity on that front.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much. Okay. Yes, would love that. Yeah, thank you so much.